All right. So does anybody have any questions from last time? Anything that people want to bring up from last time that we can discuss? Okay, so what I would like to do today is to begin with the poem of Wallace Stevens that we didn't get a chance to do last time, because that will provide us, I think, with a segue to think about the notion of light. I want to begin to get more deeply into what it means to experience light at a kind of pre-thematic level, so that we can begin to recuperate the poetic experience of the sensibility of light and how it affects consciousness. And I wanted to do that by a more contemporary poem, which will then briefly unpack. And then on the basis of that, I want to talk a little bit about time, and then we'll look at 3 poems of Bialik that will begin to get us to the more intensive focus on light and lamentation that we'll be doing beginning with next week. So what I want to do is to go today for about the first, for an hour and a half, and try to take a little bit of a break. We didn't take a break last time. So if anybody sees the time after an hour and a half, about 11, and then we'll break for maybe 15, 20 minutes, and then come back until the end of the hour. That'll give a chance for people to kind of rest up a little bit and come back in a certain way. Okay, so let me just see. So who would like to read this poem by Wallace Stevens, Final Soliloquy of the Interior Paramour? This, I think it deals both with light, and it's a beautiful poem about a kind of more contemporary sensibility, but it will evoke a number of things that I want to come in through something that's more familiar to you before we get at the language of Bialik. So who would like to read that, if anybody would? Do you all have that, I hope? Okay.
I can.
Okay, great. Oliver, please, thanks.
Sure. Light, the first light of the evening, as in a room, in which we rest and, for small reason, think. The world imagined is the ultimate good. This is, therefore, the intensest rendezvous. It is in that thought that we collect ourselves, out of all the indifferences, into one thing. Within a single thing, a single shawl, wrapped tightly around us, since we are poor, a warmth, a light, a power, the miraculous influence. Here now we forget each other and ourselves. We feel the obscurity of an order, a whole, a knowledge that which arranged the rendezvous. Within its vital boundary in the mind, we say God and the imagination are one. How high that highest candle lights the dark. Out of this same light, out of the central mind, we make a dwelling in the evening air, in which being there together is enough.
Okay. So let us use this poem as a way to begin to enter into the sensibility of light consciousness. And we're starting with a poet who is taking us both to the brink of what it means to feel the consciousness of light, which we're going to see with Bialik begins as the child's sensibility. But he's also going to bring us to a kind of a postmodern sense of a kind of illumined awareness of the relationship between light and the imagination. So I just want to call to your attention several initial lines that he speaks to from his own poetic form. And what we really want to begin to be thinking about is, are these images at the conceptual mental level? Are they abstracted from the tangibility of experience? Or is the poet reflecting in language something that precedes language, something that is preconceptual, something that's experiential? Okay, and then after we explore a little bit with Stevens, then I want to kind of talk with you a little bit about what that means, because I really want to kind of shift our minds from the pure Western conceptual, abstract, linear way of thinking, even about describing light and descriptions, to a deeper sense of of what a prophetic consciousness is, how a poetic consciousness, how the poet begins to feel the tangibility, how that tangibility works through the poet's body, and how it gives rise to a series of mental reflections, which can't be separated from the intimacy of emotion. Okay, because that's what we're trying to get at. The paradox of Bialik is that he's an older person who's constantly trying to retrieve a childhood memory, but the memory is filtered through later sensibilities. But its power is that he retains a tangibility that precedes his adult life of loss and longing and tragedy. Okay, so I want to go back first now to the poem of Stevens. Light, the first light of evening. So already light appears with this suddenness. Notice the suddenness of light and the lack of the etiology or the explanation of light. Similar to the fact that when we begin to talk about light, or we think about light, think about yourself in the morning, just opening your eyes, or your eyes in the afternoon, and light is already there. In other words, light is not something that's summoned by a verbal statement, or that our mind surrounds the light, but light is already there. The first light of evening, as in a room in which we rest. The world imagined is the ultimate good. Notice already, what is the transition that the poet has already made in this first stanza? What is, and it's something that is fundamental to all cultures, East and West, developed and non-developed. What is the movement that he will make, say, from the first line to the third line? I want you to begin to sense this and talk about this so that we can begin to feel this. What is the experiential or conceptual difference between that opening line? Light is the first light of evening. The world imagined is the ultimate good. There are two is statements, right? These are not comparative statements. He's making two is statements. But what is the difference between these two is statements? Anybody have a thought? Anything? I want to just anything, whatever comes to your mind. I want to begin.
Well, is the first one an is statement, or is it an imperative to light the light?
Light, the first, all right. So it may be an imperative. I don't think it's so much that he's invoking the light, but light is the first light of light is evening, right? He's now, it's in a kind of an immediacy, right? The immediacy of light that happens to him at a certain moment. And then the third line is the world imagined is the ultimate good. He has now moved from the experience of light to a moralizing or an ethicizing of light. Light is no longer even the notion that light is natural light as opposed to supernatural light or an interior light, that's already a metaphor or a cultural transformation of the concrete experience of light. So he now has moved from the opening image of light, the first light of evening, and the world imagined is the ultimate good. He has made an association between that feeling of the influx and the flowing in of light as the birth of a certain kind of consciousness, the birth of imagination, the birth of illumination in the mind, right? Light will become, a person is illumined. There's an illumination of consciousness, right? We talk about that, but we're trying to get beneath that, and it's the ultimate good. This notion that light is a good, as opposed to the obscuring of light or the hiding of light or the diminution of light, which will seem to be loss, absence, difference, some kind of an obscuring, right? So he's already brought this to our emotional consciousness right from the beginning. This is therefore the intensest rendezvous out of the indifferences into one thing. That is to say, from my experience of brokenness, and I'm using certain language as really kind of a hidden segue to Bialik, but in a sense, from the diversity of experience, from brokenness, from finiteness, from separateness. When I look at the world in discrete ways, that's different from the suddenness in which light appears to me, in which it takes a surrounding fullness. Light has this kind of illumined fullness that becomes its awareness, right? And it becomes present to consciousness out of the indifferences. In that thought, we collect ourselves out of the indifferences into one thing. So that a kind of inspired illumination, which is inspired by light, becomes a kind of whole, imaginary wholeness, but it's the only wholeness that he as a modern is able to feel. It's the wholeness of the imagination in which light becomes a pervasive type of presence. Within a single thing, a single shawl, a light, a power, the miraculous influence. Notice how he is describing light as a power, as a good, as something that overcomes difference, that transfers a kind of new consciousness. Now, as a modern person who is not within the framework of, let's say, revealed religion, because he stepped outside of this, as we'll see, and also for Stevens, it's the imagination, the revelation and the illumination of the human imagination, which now becomes the encompassing form of consciousness, right? Within its vital boundary in the mind, it's all taking place in the mind. He's not thinking about God in heaven and the human being on earth. He's not thinking about a transcendent consciousness and a human soul. Everything that is real is going to take place in the space of the human imagination, in the space of the human mind. We feel the obscurity of an order, a whole, a knowledge, but that is a kind of subjectivity, right? It's the subjectivity of personal consciousness. Within its vital boundary in the mind, we say God and the imagination are one. He can't escape the borders of being in his mind. Now, there's no outside the mind. It's a kind of radical philosophical idealism, but there's no outside the mind, right? A theistic religion will say there is something outside the mind. There's divine mind, or there is a higher consciousness, or this higher value, or there's something That's the language of the supernatural. It's not just natural. Our mind is natural, right? And the question is whether is there a link between a higher supernatural, something above the natural consciousness that pervades it. Religion, Western and other religions, of course, believe that that is the way in which something other enters into the natural mind, in which the human mind can then participate in something that's much more transcendent. But he's saying, I can't go outside my mind. And we're going to see that that is part of the poetry of Bialik is he can't escape his natural mind, but he has a memory that he once was connected to a divine source. And that divine source is outside. Yes, Anissa.
I guess I'm a bit confused as to how the imagination functions if you can't escape your own mind. Like, I've always thought of the imagination as being able to think outside of yourself in a lot of ways and to create new worlds. So yeah, I'm just seeking understanding of how those two things function.
All right, so let me just sharpen your point, and then I'd like some people maybe to respond to Anissa's very fine point. So when we're talking in this sense of the imagination, what is the content of the imagination? Where are we working with what infuses our mind, and the imagination reorganizes that in new conceptual and imagistic terms, right? Or does it break through a boundary into something radically other, right? If it were to break through the boundary of consciousness into something radically other, perhaps one would ascend to a kind of divine level. If it was breaking in from the other side, it would be what we would say a supernatural or a divine voice or inspiration, a spirit that's coming from elsewhere into the mind. For this kind of a poet, we're saying all that I can work with is what I can see and feel, but the moment of imaginative coherence, right? That moment when light happens and I identify with the imagination is that there's a kind of illumination of presence that's within my mind, and things cohere in a new form of clarity. At least that's the way I would begin to describe that. There are a number of people who have tried to describe what is insight or intuition. And they'll say it's not anything that's not my normal, natural way of seeing the world, but it's the world reconfigured in new patterns in which the connectivity of things changes, the drama of things changes, or we might say things shine out in a different way. We'll talk about this momentarily, that part of this notion of light for a poet is that some deeper dimension in the world shines through the natural world. So we say the tree is illumined, a flower is illumined, my beloved's face is illumined, right? Does that, how would you, is that help, or where do you want to go with that? Is that, I don't want to kind of impose this, but I want to stay within his notion that all he has is his mind. He's not speaking as a religious person in the traditional sense.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Does that help? Yeah. So in other words, when we often think about of imagination, you're thinking, I can go to another place. But it's very interesting that in medieval Jewish and Christian and Islamic philosophy, where you go with the imagination is to the source of the images in the imagination, which is a divine realm. That divine realm is the source that images or the imagination is a flooding of spiritual images that are related to God. For Jewish, Christian, and Islamic thought, there's a kind of divine dimension of the divine imagination of at the highest level of the spheres, and so that something of that impresses itself upon the spiritual aspect of the soul that can be receptive to it. But when we come, let us say, to a more modernist, romantic side, let's say Wordsworth, or we'll come to Bialik, it's the world outside that impress like a printing on me. And if my soul is resonant, it can respond to that impression of the outside world, right? So we want to at least try to keep, is the boundary porous? I think what Anissa is trying to help us see is that our first inclination, because we come from religious traditions, is that there's something beyond that shines through, that maybe illumines it from behind. And I want to talk about this momentarily. Or is everything within my sensibility? If my mind is my heart, if my mind is my brain, the images of the world make that impression upon that aspect of my experience. And then I have to deal with this. And look what so he goes, within its vital boundary, we say God and the imagination are one, right? That whether he's not saying that God is outside and infecting the imagination, or the imagination is outside. He's saying, for his point of view, these are the two moments in which we experience consciousness in a non-natural or everyday manner, where things somehow reconfigure in a new sparkle with a new light, is the divine element. But it's not that the divine element is outside imagination. It and imagination for him is one. How high the highest candle lights the dark, right? So he's now going to move to an image that we're going to see repeatedly, the notion of the candle, the small flame, something that we ignite through our own capacity, and somehow it sheds a kind of larger aura or a larger way of seeing. I'm going to come back to these issues. Out of this same light, out of the central mind. So now part of what he is implying is mind and the fullness of light, something maybe even like the Romantics of Shelley, that mind and imagination is this kind of striking, God's mind is what we see. What we're experiencing is God's mind as an imaginative force that has come present. When God says, let there be world for a romantic, it's that aspect of experience that we're feeling. It's in a certain dimension of divine mind. Divine mind might be multifold, but we are experiencing some externalization of that mind into experience. We make a dwelling in the evening air. What else do we have? The light that we have is our lonely point of orientation, but it's everything and nothing. It's our point of contact with the divine mind when it becomes illumined with that sudden moment of the candle. And we'll see these images in which being there together is enough. So what is it, being there together? Is that the human mind and the divine mind? Is it being with the light and illumination? Is it being with that person that he is sitting wrapped in this shawl of light, in a certain sense? And that from that point of view, and this is very important as we're going to come to Bialik, you lose your alienation and homelessness once you feel yourself bathed in some kind of a light, right? Now, for him, and we're going to have to see this, it's not just the natural mind. He is tapping into what he will call the divine mind, right? This central mind. And he is feeling as if it were the divine mind communicates through images and light. And our ability to connect with that filament and allow that to penetrate is the transformation of our consciousness, as if that is the candle of the mind. And we're going to see that this issue of candle and light will recur with Bialik. It's a very powerful motif within religious literature. Now, what I'd like to do for a couple of minutes now is to just reflect with you about this notion of light. And I want you to reflect along with me to get beneath the images so that we can feel. In other words, for us to feel what a metaphor is about light, we have to kind of go deeper into our mind and our feelings. And I want to just do that with you momentarily so that we can think about what we mean when we think and talk about light. And then as we move through the next few classes, we'll be at the cusp for next time that you can go back and take a look, for example, at Wolfson's article on light and Jewish mysticism, and we'll talk about these larger notions that come from the larger Jewish tradition. That when he'll have a poem called Zohar, right, illumination, what he's tapping into. So, did anybody have a chance to look at the essay by Blumenberg? Did anybody have a chance to look at that? It's a little bit difficult. He's a major contemporary thinker. Did anybody have a chance to look at that? All right, so let me make a few comments, and then I'd like you to try to take a look at that or plug into any of those paragraphs that might work for you, okay? So the central premise that we want to begin to think about is that there's more than one way to think about, to come to a conception of the world. And I'm using the word conception by talking about birth language and not just mental language, right? It's very interesting that the conceptio, the notion of a concept, really goes back to much older medieval notions of the kind of insemination of thought into the mind, and that the mind becomes pregnant. It's not just grasping, but there's a kind of birthing and insemination of a principle into the mind. But what Blumenberg wants us to begin to think about is not to begin to think about philosophical concepts only with the category of mind, only with the categories of abstract thought, only with notions of time and space that are notions that come through a more abstracted intellectualist tradition. You see, we begin thinking, we feel before we think. We experience the world before we think. And to begin to return to this Bialik sensibility as a poet of light and experience at the level of childhood is to recover these first and primordial sensibilities of what it means to open your eyes and to see, right? So if you open your eyes in the morning and you see light, what kinds of images come to your mind, which are not simply the images of abstract thought? I want you to begin to kind of try to get yourself back to this kind of beneath. We want to, because the feeling will give birth to metaphor long before it gives birth to conceptual thought. And in order to think along with the poet, we have to get behind the conceptual structure to the concreteness of the metaphor, which is arising from a physical tone or sensibility. I want you to begin to think about this. So when you open your eyes in the morning, what are the sensibilities that you feel? Anybody want to just anything? I just want to just to begin to hear your voice. There's no right and wrong. There's just you, right? Just wait, some thoughts that you have. Yes, Oliver.
It's kind of like there's almost a sense of ex nihilo, like you just wake up and it's from nothingness, kind of, and from a
Well,
deep state of just
that's very. Isn't that nice that you chose that classical term ex nihilo? Because part of this issue is that these notions of philosophical and mystical terminology, from Blumenberg's point of view, are born from primary experience. There's nothing in the world, right, that would necessarily lead you to say ex nihilo, creatio ex nihilo, right? It's even pushing that in terms of scripture, because scripture talks about some primordial aspect that's already pre-existent, right? So part of, I think, what we're saying is out of nothing, and as from out of my dream state, I have world. From out of the closure and the darkness, or let us say the diffusion of images, I have world, right? World comes to me, right? It's not like I don't have world, but I don't have the world that has value, okay? What immediately comes to consciousness is the presence of value. Light will become a value, let us say good, as opposed to the obscuring of light, which becomes a lesser good, right? Although we're going to see the power of the moon as a different kind of light, a more feminine light, but we're going to have to see different kinds of light, or the cloaking of the light. Another thing I think that's lying behind Oliver's point is that we might even play on this sense of the nihilo, right? The nihil is the nothing, from the nothing. But in mystical terms, the nihil is the fullness of everything. It's what can't be conceptualized. The nihil is the fullness which becomes something, but it becomes something that I don't invoke. It happens to my awareness, right? That's the suddenness. If you allow yourself to experience the suddenness, and light is tactile, right? It has a tactility to it. It may even have a warmth to it, or depending on your climate, it might have the cold feel of winter, right? And we'll see Bialik will have these kinds of issues. I'm trying to help you get back to the level of being a child's consciousness, to understand the poetry that we're going to be spending our time on. What emerges with light is what we would call presence and fullness. Now, I don't immediately make the distinction between this and that. Things appear in a kind of illumined panorama that surround me, right? My whole notion of orientation within the light is something that a poetic consciousness is trying to come to terms with, right? And then I may begin to think about aspects of life, of light, which are fundamental. Like Where is the source of light, right? So I could say it's in the sun. Is the sun the source of the light? Where is the source of that light? Or is that source an interior? We'll see culturally the notion where the light is exterior and transcendent, or it's interior and immanent, or that the divine illumines the soul and gives it that light, right? Light does different kinds of things. So just to use a kind of another modern thinker, think about Walter Benjamin. One of the ways that he talked about what light does when you're looking at the world is to think of an aura. There are many painters, for example, when they look at the world, they see the shimmering of light, say, around the flower, what we would call an aura, so that things become illumined from behind and around it, right? That very notion has many cultural dimensions that we see. Just think, and this goes back to ancient Mesopotamia. Kings appear with a halo. Halo is really the sun that's shining from behind. Saints appear with a halo. Icons appear with that light that's coming. In other words, so then we begin to think about the notion of being illumined, right? Right? To have a thought is to illumination, to be enlightened, which already in different kinds of contexts would mean what? Our natural self is dark, dim, not able to see, and we need something to illumine from elsewhere, right? That's already a very different notion. Where does that light come from that allows us to see? Is it coming from the divine outside, or from the awakening to be illumined? There's an awakening of some kind of candle within the soul. Is that a natural thing? Or does it require something through a divine stimulation? What I'm trying to help you begin to see is that there's a movement from our natural experience to our linguistic experience to the more conceptual notions that religions are really talking about in very different terms. In other words, we're moving towards cultural language, but this cultural language goes much deeper, right? What is the source when we say a person sees the light, or you say, you use these metaphors, the light of reason? What does the light of reason mean? What is behind a note, the light of reason? Or we say the light of experience. Why would a person say the light of experience as opposed to the light of reason? What totally different worldview is reflected there? Or if we say natural light as opposed to supernatural light, or if we say a person is dull, or if I say it didn't dawn on me, what am I concretely giving? These are going to be images we're going to see momentarily in Bialik. It didn't dawn on me. A person doesn't see the light, or he or she sees the light. What does that mean, right? Why, for example, would you have images of Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad when they're born? There's a light that emerges from birth that fills the room. Why? Where does that imagery come from? It's not just borrowing from one other tradition. Of course it's borrowing from other traditions because people live in layered cultural ways, but they will only borrow it if it's real in a spiritually rich sense, right? So to say that Jesus is born within is illumination as opposed to Moses, that's saying something about the relationship between Christianity and Judaism. And if Muhammad is a figure of light in the birth and the room is illumined, what is that saying when that image now becomes a dominant birth image, right? Or if you have images of Jesus with a halo, already a halo, having done nothing, is there a natural state of illumined perfection? Or do you have to work at that? The whole notion of spiritual growth in Judaism and in other religions is that you have to cultivate something that will grow from within, right? Unless you're receiving that illumination from outside. So I haven't yet really talked about cosmological images or mystical images. We're going to see that because Bialik is filled with that, and we're going to be turning to that as we move to his poetry again. But what I really wanted you to begin to realize is to begin to feel the primacy of feeling, and that feelings precede thought. And cultures, even in their idea, a culture becomes alienated from itself when it may become too philosophical and abstract, and it's losing touch with what it means to feel the imagery of the world. Okay? So is light in this world? Is it natural? Does it come from elsewhere? Is light only a spiritual quality, or is it an ethical value? Right? We think about that. Can you bear the light? Just think, and with this will make the transition. Just think of the power of the notion of a cave. All right? You all know the power of a cave with Plato, right? Right? So a person who is in the dark, who is lost, and their mind has not been cultivated, is in the dark. Or light comes from some other place and it casts shadows, right? It casts images. So that's when we think about the illusions or the shadow mind. We're talking about that it's not coming from a direct place. It's coming, the light, if I'm seeing and the light is from behind me and it's shining light on the wall of the cave, it's passing, I am the blockage of the light. Right? That's not necessarily a high quality. It's not coming through my mind. It's having to pass through the thickness of my body. And then, so just think about that. That's an image that it's going to be very powerful, even in Jewish mysticism work. Already here in the Talmudic material of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who goes into a cave. Or in the mystical tradition, he goes into the cave, and that's where there's a cultivation of mystical awareness. And then the person comes out. So in Plato, when that person comes out of the cave being dark, we might say the cave being a womb of preparation. It may be female. In ancient Roman religions, caves are wombs. And then the person comes out towards the outside. Feel this notion of inside, outside. Wet birth womb, the child coming into the light. The whole notion of what birth means when a head crowns from the vagina in birth. It's an amazing thing. It's a halo, it's the crown, right? The crown, a crown has all kinds of incredible symbolism in mystical traditions. It's the kind of that first light as a source, right? But you remember in Plato, when the person turns and goes outside the cave, they can't see. You can't see the directness of light. This is also something we want to begin to consider, right? right? The psalmist says, Be'orcha nir'eh or. In your light, we see light. Now, you can be inside the light because God's light as illumination is that in which I can see. It's not for nothing that in the 19th century, for example, when Herder first wrote his aesthetic work on Genesis, he made the point that the rabbis made long before, or Philo made long before. Why is the first thing, Vayehi or, there is light? Because all of a sudden there is isness or there's difference. How could you talk about isness and difference until you have light, right? And it's an isness before different, but when you come out of the cave, light is blinding. You can't see, you have to adjust your eyes. So for example, it will be very common, particularly in Jewish mystical tradition, but we have it also in the Romantics. It appears in Neoplatonic traditions that affect Christianity and Islam. There is a garment or concealments of light, depending on how that divine light enters the world, because you can't bear the fullness of the light, right? You can't bear the fullness of the light. Or what happens is that as you ascend in consciousness, you may strip away some of those garments of the light, right? So that you can become acculturated and accommodated to the light. Light, from that point of view, light has to be earned by that your mind has to expand, open up. Your eyes have to be able to receive the beams of divine presence into the eye, right? And then there's a period of accommodation. So that, okay. And then with this final thing, we'll turn to Bialik. The whole notion of light as a way of marking time. So we live within a solar calendar, right? And so we think of light as something daily, something that rises, and the sense of time in a primary culture is the arc of the sun across. The first ray, as we'll see this poem, Ayelet HaShachar, the rays of the female dawning, of the color of the dawn, of the gazelle of dawn, that begins to appear over the horizon. Is the dawn the light? Or is that just the Amud HaShachar? Is there a light before there's dawn? How do you mark the birth of light? How do you sanctify the birth of light if you're in a religious culture? Is there a difference between the morning light and the light when the sun begins to tip across the horizon? Well, in ancient Judaism and other religions, that becomes a different kind of prayer or sacrifice. And then the setting of the sun, right? Or sun establishes quadrants across the year, the solstice, right? And so on and so forth, right? That's one gross way of marking time. But what if you lived within a lunar calendar, right? Today in the Jewish lunar calendar, it's Rosh Chodesh. It's the first month. It's the first day of a particular month, right? Chodesh is Chadash. It's new. It's the first sliver of light, right? The notion of month is newness because time now is calibrated by the movement from a sliver of light to a full moon to the passing. In other words, it's calibrated both by a kind of nightly, it's calibrated both by a nightly course, but it's calibrated by different forms of distinction. For example, the moon in most of these traditions, but particularly in Judaism and Islam, is female. Because a woman goes through a monthly course. It's a different way of marking time. But if that's not just female time, but there's a divine dimension of that movement of time, one thinks in ethical and spiritual terms differently. The birth of light, the kind of impregnation of light, the pregnancy of light, the birth of something, or the loss, or the diminution, right? Or the moon in the sky. We're going to talk about the Venus star, the morning star, the imagery of the crescent and the morning star. Perhaps Aditya will talk a little bit more about that from Islam. But why is that a powerful image of consciousness? Right? If you're walking in the darkness of the desert, the moon becomes a primary globe of consciousness, right? The sun of the day is a killer, right? You have to find shade, right? There is something more soothing about this. Or the moon is the feminine, and it's marked in a different way of experiencing time, right? So the marriage between the male and the female, between the sun and the moon, different ways of feeling about time are going to affect consciousness long before they become encoded in words and religious symbolism. And if religious symbolism doesn't tap into these primordial experiences, these religious issues just die away. They don't work anymore, right? And alienation is because perhaps for many people, modern consciousness can't feel that primacy anymore. The greatness of poets is that they still feel this, and they try to return us to this primordiality. So let us, with that as a little bit of background, let's spend a little bit of time taking a look at this poem, the Hebrew Al Ayelet HaShachar. It's the poem of the morning, on the morning star, on the morning star. Okay, so I hope that you had looked at that. I want us to, as we will do, I want to read all of these through together, both once in the Hebrew and then in one of the English translations. Just a word of background, just so that you can feel something that's not at the tip of things. Two things. One is that Bialik makes a note when he writes the poem Ayelet HaShachar is the superscription that appears for Psalm 22. Psalm 22 is called for the dawn, for Ayelet HaShachar. And he chose this one to imitate medieval Spanish poetry, in which there were poems that were recited at various points in the liturgy. These were called piyutim, liturgical poetry. And he's imitating poetry of people like Yehuda Halevi and others who wrote poems for the first note, the first blessing in the morning after the call to prayer is the prayer of light, of the renewal of light, Yotzer Or. And that is called, in traditional language, the Me'orah, the light prayer. It's the first of the prayers in which the medieval poets would write, and he is imitating that. Now, there's something else that we'll see will come to association. There are many associations in Jewish mystical literature that he's playing on, and maybe we'll come to that. But the other thing that I just wanted to bring to your attention, you'll see that as Bialik moves across the course of this poem, he refers to his loss of faith that he once had felt as a youth, but he no longer feels that. And he remembers that. And Psalm 22 is famous in the Christian tradition, not just the Jewish tradition, because it begins, Eli, Eli, lama azavtani, right? You know that from the New Testament. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani in Aramaic. My Lord, why have you abandoned me? So Bialik has chosen this because it's a poem of the birth of light that will also evoke in the soul his own brokenness as having lost contact with an illumination that was present to him as a child, right? And he is trying to hold on to that through the poetic language. But all that we have is a kind of nostalgia. Now, so let us read first the poem in the Hebrew. It's a little bit long, but maybe some of you will be looking at it in one translation, and then when we read it in English, we'll look at it in the other translation. We have two of them, and I want to pick out several phrases because I want to use this poem as our first entry into the tangibility of light, into the way metaphors dramatize primary experience, and how he evokes a certain type of the consciousness of awareness, right? So let us maybe, why don't we can do it in three kind of segments. If those of you have the Hebrew, let's begin with the first part maybe, and then we'll do this in kind of three particular units so that we can, it won't be too much. So Ido, would you like to read, or anybody else want to do the Hebrew? So if you can begin with the couplet that begins Nechsefu at the beginning. In the Atari, it's the rim of the heavens bared, and we're going to go down to the Ushchakim Yechevru Yelchu Haloch Vaor, in which in the English of Adari, it's and the skies blanch and grow lighter. So let's at least, we're going to do this in three quick units. I want to use this as a kind of transition to his other sensibilities, but I've chosen these to reflect certain very, very primary notions before he gets to deeper cultural issues. So would you be happy, Ido, would you do that? Great. Okay. Yeah, you're muted, I think. So
Yeah,
we're going to read it.
so
Okay, we're going to read the Hebrew first, and then I want to have one reader of the English. If you're only working with the English, hear it, look at one translation now, maybe the Nouveau or the Atari. Actually, I think it's only the Atari has the translation, so let's just stay with that. Okay. Go ahead.
אוקיי. נחשפו שולי רקיע, וידרוך על ציפו השחר, ויצב הליל, צא מפה. וישנה פני הכושי, וישלחהו, ויאסוף נרותיו, ויכבה כוכבי נשפו. וילט פניו בהדרתו השחרחרה, ויתפרק נזמי הזהב, ויצא את בגפו. ללין בעמקים ובחורשים מצילים, לשיט בכפים על הטלפים כפו. רק הלל בן שחר עוד קורץ עינו, לא יכבה נרו ולא יחיה רשפו. קבוע כנופך ביריעת תכלת, יפץ אור צחר מנקודת כספו. חובאו כוכבי בוקר תימוג עייפתה, מנשמת השחר ומניד עפעפו. ושפת היריעה קדמה מתלבנת, ובאחרית ים עוד יאיב באפו. ושחקים יחברו ילכו הלוך ואור, יחבר יקום בכל אגפו.
Okay, thank you. That's a brief. Someone read the opening part of Atari. Good, Timna, thank you. Unmute yourself, so thanks.
On the morning star, the rim of the heavens bared, and on its step, dawn placed its foot and told night, out of here. And he changed his black face and sent him to gather his candles up and put out his party lights. And he hid his face in his coat all gloom and took out his nose rings of gold and went out slow and alone, to doze in the valley and the shadowy woods, to lay his hands on the bats hanging in the clefts. Only Venus now still in the sky winked her eye and would not douse her flame nor dim her fire. Fixed like a garnet in the sky of blue, she traffics white light from her silver hook. The stars of morning hidden, darkness melts in the breadth of dawn and flap of his white lids. And the eastern lip of the canopy pales, while behind the sea its nose in darkness hides. And the skies blanch and grow lighter and light. The universe pales, and so does every one of its limbs.
Okay, thank you. Let's just stop there because that's a good, it's some kind of a transition. So I just want to begin to hear your initial responses to this. But remember, last time we talked about Eliot's notion of tradition and the individual talent. And we wanted to realize that in many cases, a great poet plays on or evokes very traditional imagery, right? And the imagery would carry a certain kind of ironic weight for the readers. So Al Ayelet HaShachar, of course, evokes as indicating not just the morning star, but as we'll see, there's a feminine here of the Ayelet HaShachar that will play off against the male Halel ben Shachar, that who will arise. There's a kind of male-female aspect of the two aspects of the dawn. But Ayelet HaShachar would evoke for Bialik and for Jewish readers the fact that this refers to the Shekhinah. It refers to the feminine presence of God, traditionally. And it refers, in other cases, to Esther, Queen Esther, who is identified on Purim with the Shekhinah, who is the moon that is hidden. Her name, Esther, is Hester, is hiddenness. And there's a kind of sense that there is hiddenness and light, this oscillating movement of the moon, which has value of positivity and negativity. But Bialik goes even farther than that, which the translators are missing, but that you want to be able to pick up. Let me just give you a couple of hints at that. So when he says Nechsefu Shulei Rakia, and it's translated here, the rim of the heavens bared. It's true that there is an uncovering as the dawn begins to press away the night, right? But the Shulei Rakia, which is here the all of this opening line is alluding to a vision in Isaiah chapter 6, where the prophet sees God sitting on a throne and God's skirts or garment, reach down to the earth. In other words, it's not the rim. It's really the kind of encasing or garment of heaven that is now being pulled away, because in that image of God, God's body is concealed and covered. And the imagery that he's playing with is that there's a divine development, which he's now reading in secular terms, that this language, he's trying to feel the movement of the dawn of light in the sky as this disrobing of some dark cloak. And behind all of this is the imagery of God's robe that covers the entire earth and that conceals. That's when he also says, Vayidroch al sipo. and it sort of covers on it steps on its foot on the out on that area. The sipo is really, the sipim is really the pillars of heaven. In other words, what Bialik has done is chosen language from a cosmic vision, and he is now remythicizing this in terms of the natural force of this kind of disrobing of the garment of heaven so that it can be seen, stepping on the rim of the shachar, right? And it that's what the shachar is doing. It's emerging. He's giving us a sense of how do you feel the personification of dawn, right? Where the shachar is a divine dimension for him. It's light as appearance, and the shachar, the light, says, tonight, tsemipo. So he, in a certain sense, he's alluding to the fact that night is a kind of slave that's being manumitted or released. We know that he's alluding to this text in Exodus 21 about sending forth a slave, because at the end of the third couplet, where it says, and he went out, how does he here, the translation says he went out slow and alone, but it's vayetze at begapo is alluding to a slave who goes out in his body. Begapo yavo, begapo yetze. He comes in with his body, goes out with his body, even if he got married in the meantime. Bialik is now using this language of release, of sending forth. And the Hebrew ear, or the ear that is saturated with the Hebrew Bible, is hearing that language, right? And there's also a there are other aspects which I think this attempt to speak to the contemporary ear of the Israeli trivializes. So in Atari's second line, he says to gather his candles up and put out his party lights. So for modern Israeli, a neshef is like a kind of party. But for biblical and rabbinic Hebrew, neshef is the nighttime. It has nothing to do with that party status, right? It is a metaphor for evening. And here, so it just shows that when everything we were talking about last time, when in this movement from traditional language to contemporary language, you have to be careful that you don't thin it out so much that it becomes trivialized. And what he's really trying to do is to talk about that. And again, another image that you might want to pay attention to. So he says he hid his face in his coat of gloom. Well, that works as a poetic line, but what the poet is alluding to, "Vayalet panav ba'adarto hashecharchoret," is that the night is hiding its face. He's alluding to the fact that Elijah on Mount Carmel in 1 Kings 19, when there is this divine revelation, he covers his face with his cloak, the aderet, right? So there's a kind of inversion of prophetic imagery that is he's not choosing that accidentally. Well, for those who know Hebrew, when he says vayalet, which means to conceal, he's playing on the word lalut, which means in Aramaic means to curse. There's a kind of negativity to this closure. What I'm trying to indicate is that there are resonances that the ironic ear that's coming from the tradition will hear that the modern person will lose. And he's counting on this new secularizing of Hebrew language that retains the resonance of the traditional language, which now gives it its irony and power. And of course, what he calls the aderet, the cloak, hashcharchoret, hashchachora, which is the kind of kind of all gloom, he's punning on Shachar, right? So there's a kind of tension between Shachar, which is light, and the Shachora, which is the gloom, that kind of border place between the emergence of light and so on. Notice how he now so strongly, and internal rhymes. For those who know Hebrew, I just want to pick up. He says, "Vayalet panav." So it covers its face, and it's "Vayetze at." Vayalet at. It goes out slowly. This kind of internal rhyming that the poet is able to capture, that intensifies that. What most poets will do, that there's an internal sonority that captures a kind of value tension. Vayalet, of the covering over, and at, going out slowly, just like Shachar and Shechachora. These are internal tensions within this sonority. The same way that he then goes on to talk about how it goes to descend, the evening descends into a cave, like a bat cave, of the wetness of the cave, and all the puns, the kefim and the atalefim, right? He's playing on that. And then light kind of bursts open. Yafetz or tzachar minekudat kaspo. There's the attentiveness of the eye that sees the dawning of light as a silver gleam, as an eye, the play of this bursting forth of light, and then the kind of moisture fading of the evening, as a kind from the breath of the shachar and the wink of the eyes. So can you feel what he is, what he's capturing through this personification, right? There's a kind of return to a kind of mythic personification of the world. One of the powers of poetry, of course, is to take metaphors and to turn those metaphors into active, dramatic terms. And here he is now had the nishmat hashachar uminid af apo. So the breath of the shachar and the blink of the eyelid of the dawn is what's beginning to be felt over the rim of the horizon. Let's go on and maybe and read some more. Ido, do you want to continue? Ushchakim.
Sure. ושחקים יחברו, ילכו הלוך ואור, יחבר היקום וכל אגפו. יגיחו יגלו מבטן החושך. The Hebrew file breaks off here. Let me pull it up.
Okay,
really quick.
Okay, do you have it?
I can pull it up. Here from Ben Yehuda. So,
well, why don't we be reading while you're finding it? Why don't we read it in the English, and then we can. I don't want to.
I found it.
Okay, great. Okay.
יגיחו יגלו מבטן החושך, ויכה האופל את בלעו וטרפו. ועד לבן יעל מחמי הנחל, ודייג משקים משית צינה מחופו. ובעשבים רטובים מרסיסי לילה, מפלג בעמק הפלג לשטפו. ירעד על חצציו הומה ומבעבע, יקפץ כילד ומה יפה קצפו. ומלוא תבל יחריש דומם ויחיל, לצאת השמש בעזוז תקפו.
Okay, so why don't we read that? Read that so far in the English up to the notion of the entrance of the sun in its glory. So here we have the kind of the birthing of light that he's going to see as a child. The attentiveness the attentiveness to time and space. Let's see whether we can do this, and then we'll take a brief break. Okay, yeah. Tim, no, someone else want to read the English? Do you want to continue, or someone else want to read? Anybody else? Yes, Mark,
I will.
please.
Yeah.
Okay, please.
They slip out, revealed from the belly of night, and darkness vomits up all that it ate. And a white cloud aspires from warm water's stream, and the fisherman rises to push his boat from the beach. And in the grasses wet from the slivers of night, the brook in the valley flows to his great flood. Trembles on tiny stones, all murmur and bubble, skips like a child, and how beautiful the turmoil. And all of creation falls silent and awaits the entrance of sun in its glory and might.
Okay, so what kind of images and thoughts come to your mind? What is this evoking in you? What kind of terms, what is he trying to convey? How does he do it? Oliver, please.
Yeah, I have one thing that struck me about the Hebrew reading, even though I don't speak Hebrew, but I noticed the repetition of the O sound and po and o. And I know in other poetic traditions that, well, Russian is the one that I'm familiar with. And when there's a repetition of the O sound, sometimes it can mean like a mourning or kind of represent a crying sound or a maybe even a lamentation. So I was just wondering if that is a possibility here or
Okay. I think he's I think what you're trying to get at is that it's much more than the pronoun suffix, right? It's not just gapo, et cetera, but it's trying to evoke a certain kind of state of feeling, a certain state of consciousness, right? Okay. So what else is he trying to get at? What else do you feel in this imagery, in this language? What does he see as a person, as he sees the dawn? What comes to his eye that we would not be attentive to? Right. So there's this sense of the sparkling of light off of the stones of the brook, right? And then there's also sound. So this kind of mixture of the sparkling of light and then this dawning of sound over against the crass imagery of the vomiting of night, right? There's a birthing that has this positive quality and this negative valence of the night. Darkness vomits up all that it ate. There's this kind of twofoldness about this birthing. On the one hand, it's a kind of newness, and another sense he has a kind of the sense of the night as a monster that has done. But the white cloud and the water stream, seeing the fishermen. He's writing this, of course, in Russia, and he's seeing people going down to the dock, and he's feeling the water and the murmur and the bubble, and how beautiful the turmoil. And then this sense of silence before the birth of the sun coming up. And he wants you to feel that sense of silence. And just we can go on here quickly with the English. Those of you the Hebrew, take a look at that. But it's the light, brightening light. The sun has peeped, and night laid his eyes on her and turned his back. The Hebrew is even more powerful. It's or barkaya shemesh hatetzitza. In the old temple, the priests at the dawn would cry out, or barkai. There's a kind of burst of light. There's a kind of the day has a kind of voice. The day is shouting out the call of light. And when that call of light comes, the call of light stops the angry dogs in their track. He's playing on old Talmudic imagery that there's a certain kind of mysterious moment between the light of day and the birth of the sun, when anger and arousal is in this kind of state of strange expectation. And then he speaks about this dawning of light, and the human being who rushes out to earn their food and their daily bread, and the poet who now feels, let's just go back to towards the end. V'leiv halal kelibi ye'or impitz o asher kala ketzo v'yavo cherpo. There's this arousal. The ye'or of arousal is, of course, echoing the issue of light, which is or. But it's a heart that's become destitute. The imagery of the birth of light is now evoking in the poet his own loss of sustenance, his own loss of clarity, his own loss of spiritual connectivity that has moved away. And he remembers, Yireh ziv Adonai mitchadesh la b'karim, v'shav limei alumav, v'zachar yemei chorpo. So he remembers a kind of childhood time. He remembers a time in which he connected with the awaiting of the dawn of the light as the awaiting of an illumination, when he connected with a divine presence. And he dreams of that. He dreams of that like Joseph has this dream. But he mourns. The poet shifts into this language of lament. V'ata aha, v'hu tzeir alpo. But this was a kind of loss of light from childhood, which he no longer feels. And he feels that loss when Elohim sach ba'ado mi'asher supo. Now he feels God as a hedge that hedges him around and torments his soul. Right? The poet is alluding to the fact of the book of Job. The Satan says to God, Job will never give in because God has hedged him around in a protective way. He's made a sach ba'ado. And then later on, Job cries out, you have hedged me around with pain, and I can't escape my pain. And then the poem ends with this waiting for mishomrim la boker, alluding, you can look up in Psalm 130, the poet who is nafshi shomrim la boker, mishomrim la boker. There's a kind of waiting. That is his only hope. This is a poem of reflection and loss, of the mythology and the mythopoeic tenor of the birth of light, and the transition to what for Bialik will be most real. That light is a kind of dawning and a evocation of childhood. Childhood being a kind of time of innocence and a time of connectivity, that the light is a transparent thing. Now he's shomrim laboka, he's waiting the dawn, right? But now this waiting the dawn is not this awaiting the natural emergence of light across the rim of the heaven. It's the waiting for the dawning of a renewal of his spiritual awareness. He holds on to memory, and this waiting for notice how the poet is able to hold together both the side of the natural world and its emergence, and this abortive, temporary holding on to a kind of rebirth within his own soul. The awaiting for the movement of light across the horizon is now given a kind of inverted value as he awaits the kind of rebirth of a kind of spiritual awareness and consciousness. Anybody have any other thoughts about this? But this is a kind of very early poem of Bialik in which he's using psalms, he's using natural imagery, he's using the experiential world, and he's showing his acute powers of observation and description through very, very inverted plays on traditional language. And it's also of value to us because it shows us at this very early stage of his poetic emergence, how he personifies this world of childhood, how he allows the world to become, that the emergence of the natural light of the day is correlated with the darkness of his inner being, and this awaiting, and this mishomrim nafshi laboker, mishomrim laboker. That's that ending. My soul is waiting, among the waiting for the light, for the dawn. So here we have encapsulated in this citation from Psalm 130 is this pivotal moment. That moment, you remember, when there seems to be the gleam and it's shouted, or barkai, there's light, and there's dead silence. And there is the dog doesn't bark, and there's the silence in the world, and the cockcrow hasn't happened yet. But for him, it evokes the deepest emphasis of emptiness in his own being. And he has taken over all that language of expectation. Ayelet al ayelet hashachar. It's a kind of singing for the dawning of the day. And he is simply waiting for Godot, waiting for the dawn of light, waiting for the emergence of something in his soul. And this blending between the natural world and the spiritual world. Anybody have any other thoughts that you want to bring, or any lines that you wanted to focus on? Yes, Ido. Yeah, and then Guido.
I just wanted to kind of in line of what Oliver's comment before about the repetition of the O sound, which is right. It's a possessive pronoun in Hebrew. So
right, exactly.
cherpo, kirbo, alpo. So everything in the poem is his. So from the speaker point of view, it all belongs to someone else, not to him. So it creates, I think, a kind of space, a poetic space where the poet or the speaker is really minimized. He doesn't have anything. Nothing is his in this place. And I think it's just interesting to think about this in relation to the poem we read last week. Lo zachiti ba'or min ha'hefker, the light, I didn't win it from abandoned things. It's mine. And I think that like this strand of possession, what is mine, what is not mine, is something that actually runs through a lot of Bialik's poetry. And here it seems to be, it creates a kind of realm that he doesn't have a place in. And
I think I think your point is very beautiful. I would insert into that, and not just to tack on to what you're saying. This space of space of subjectivity is displaced into the third person. I think that's what the two, and of course Oliver's feeling the lament of that, the kind of woe sound of that. But it's the subjective voice of the poet can't yet say I. It's displaced into it, he, that. There's a kind, and that space of separation magnifies at the level of personification and persona and person, his distant from the tradition and his distant from the spiritual light. It's not just the natural light. That natural light evokes in him his subjective loss, which is what you are highly picking up. And as a romantic poet, he is sinking into himself, but he can't focus on that I yet. We'll see poems where he does connect with his I, but what you are both picking up on is that the O sound, it's that otherness that he's looking out upon it as something else that he can't yet bring into his, he's shomrim, he's waiting. Gideon, you had a point.
Yeah, I think just one other thing that I wanted to briefly think about is like, it's fascinating to me to think about like almost like the sort of double-edged nature of this liminal moment between darkness and light, because I feel like so much of the natural imagery here, I'm mostly looking at this moment where, I mean, again, this is the translation, but they use the language of the like the white cloud aspiring. And I think that notion of like, there's something very sort of not only positive, but I mean, yeah, like aspirational and sort of reaching for something bigger. And then I think at the same time, we sort of have this narrator's feeling like lost and feeling sort of missing and sort of not having that same quality. And I think it's really interesting to sort of situate that in the moment where like at sort of first light, but before sort of like the sun reveals itself. Because I think that to me also is the moment where like
nice, yeah.
Light is most strongly felt as opposed to like considered intellectually, because like, you know, you don't see the source of it and you just sort of have this general illumination, like sort of just like, I mean, sort of almost, I mean, similar to a halo where it's just sort of starting to rise up, but the source of that light has not been revealed yet. And I think that it's interesting to me to think about that moment where it's like slightly before dawn, but also it's part of the dawn as well. And thinking about how that moment has like a lot of variance held in it, whereas a lot of the times when, you know, when it's light out or when the world is sort of bathed in light, it's relatively straightforward to be like, oh, the sun like lights up this stuff. You sort of have to like search, you have to sort of like, deal with the light on this level of feeling in this moment in particular. So I think it's interesting that the poem sort of situates itself in this moment specifically.
That's lovely. That's lovely. I think that you're adding to this the emotional valence of transition between dark and light, between the dark and light inwardness of what you can, what can you see and what can you not see? What can you hope for and what can you not hope for? What do you wait for? And that it's the path of, that's what I think what you're capturing, and both of you in this different way is you're capturing the valence of light as a transitional moment before the subjective eye can become aware of itself, that it's aware of itself as liminal. I think you used the term liminal, but there is the whole poem is marked by liminality, by being at the border, and it's the border of night and day. It's the border of light and dark. It's the border of a world being renewed and a soul still sunk in itself. It's his whole emotional confusion that the night gives birth to the day, but there's a vomiting, but there's also a birthing. This, and I think I would just close with this so we can take a little bit of a break. But when he says, my heart was empty within me, this is a traditional line that mystics use to have emptied one's subjectivity so that you can feel God's presence. Playing on this psalm, many of the mystics in Jewish mystical tradition, when they say libi halal b'kirbi, they say my heart has been emptied within me so that the divine presence can fill me. But he's now talking about this as a kind of emptying of self completely, of this, and then he goes on to say, Yireh ziv Adonai mitchadesh l'bkarim. There's still a kind, that person, not yet me, still, he can see this ziv. That's the splendor of the divine glory. Ziv is a mystical term. It's not just the ray it's the effulgence. It's used as a kind of more than light. It's that aspect that when you see it, you know you're not seeing natural light. You're seeing a radiance, right? And he sees that radiance, mitchadesh lebekarim. It's being anew every single day, but Vishavli me alumav v'sachar itchepo, and he remembers loss, right? Is seeing and the memory of the loss. That renewal no longer is the renewal of his soul, but it evokes a kind of lamentation of a lost childhood in which the dawning of light was the presence of God. So I have a 10 of, like it's 10 of 11. Let's maybe cut our break a little bit short. I want to then turn to the poem. I want to talk about the erotics of the adolescent in the butterfly. And then we'll, and then talk a little bit maybe about the imps of the evening, because I wanted to also talk about evening as well as we make a transition to next week, where we really talk about mystical imagery. So don't go out of the thing. So I have to let you back in. Why you can just sort of mute and stop your video, and then I will. I have 10 off. I will click on in about 9 minutes, and we'll start on the hour. Okay. So take a few minutes to yourself. I'm going to stop the recording now. Someone remind me to click back on. Okay. Okay. So let us turn to the poem, The Butterfly, the Siporet. In this particular case, what I want us to, we're sort of inching towards this kind of fullness of light that becomes the signature of Bialik's soul as a child. But here we have something that we don't usually find in his poetry. And that is this relationship between the light, adolescence, and the delicacy of conveying eros in a boy who comes from an extremely traditional society, and he has the arousal of sexual awareness, walking with a girl, and the butterfly will convey something of that delicacy, both of light and of touch, and of awareness. And how Bialik, as an adolescent, will be aware of light, but the real issue is now what's being aroused in him is a deeper emotion, is the natural emotion of eros, and his sense of the girl and his visuality of her body that's conveyed by the braids on the back of her neck. Very rarely does he convey this longing for love. Usually what the longing is for the content with the lost tradition, with God. But here he has revealed to us something else, and he uses light to do that. So I'd like to spend maybe 20, 25 minutes on this very beautiful poem, and then talk about the other ones of the imps or the gnomes of the light, because that will be our transition to a kind of other notion. And it also will allow us to see his use of evening light, which for many poets is as powerful and as significant. So let us turn to the poem. If there's other people besides Ido, I don't want to overuse your goodwill and your good reading voice, which is very beautiful. But let's read the Tsiporet, which is from 1904. So this is almost much later while he's in Russia. It's written in the summertime. I think he's looking back at an encounter. We know that he had an encounter with a young Russian girl. Perhaps this is that, or maybe it's a Jewish girl. We don't know. Okay. So Oliver, if you have, I guess he has some internet. All right, whatever you can do, Oliver. Hopefully, but we have the recording. So let's take a look at that. There are different translations. I won't overly emphasize the good and the bad, but you have both Ruth Nevo's translation and you have Atari's. So let's first read this very beautiful poem of the delicacy of adolescent eros, the seeing of a girl's body by a young boy who is allowing himself and not allowing himself to feel that emotion and conveying but not conveying what it means to feel that strangeness at this when he's reflecting on this. He's still a yeshiva boy, a boy who had who only knew the most puritanical of closed religious tradition, and he's feeling what anybody would feel at a certain age, and we'll see he's going to use certain kind of terms which will reflect his first contact with that ambivalence. There's a kind of something is arousing and he doesn't know how to name it, but he feels it and he sees it, and that's what's so remarkable here of light and eros and adolescence coming to expression. Okay, so I hope that Oliver is somehow there. If you can hear us, Oliver, just send me send a chat to us. Otherwise, we'll be able to get the recording. So who maybe Ido, would you read the Tziporet? That'll be great. Anybody else who would like to read Hebrew at any point, please let me know. But Ido is being so kind to do this. Okay.
כל העולם טובע באור ובשיר, אוצרות חיים לא שערתים מסביב מתרחשים, ובמשעול הנמתח בין יער וניר, שנינו הולכים ומחשים. אנו הולכים והולכים, לשבילנו אין קץ, כפפונו שיבולים, כיפרונו ציפורות, ובחניתות של זהב יפגענו כל עץ, ובצאלי צמרות. הדמות כרוב עם אב קלה ברום עולם רפרפה, אך גם היא חיש הפליגה למדינת הים, ואת הרהורי הטהור כמוה ורם, נשאה עמה לנצח על כתפה. ושוב זוהר רקיע ושוב תכלת בלי סוף, את הולכת בראש ואני כרוך אחרייך, ובכמותיו המלאות השתרע הנוף, והכל בהיר בו כמו בעינייך. רגע אחד לי נדמה, ביער הלז, המאפיל ומשיב צנעתו עלינו, גנוז מטמון מסתרים, המשומר מאז ומעולם לשנינו. פתאום רחפה הקמה, ומפה אלי פה עברתת קרניים על פני האוקיינוס. הו, מי השליג עלינו, ובשפע זה חל ציפורות לבנות. והנה נקלעה ציפורת כפרח בקצה, שיער מחלפתך המפזזה על המחגורת, וכמו רמזה לי, בחור, קום שקלה ודמה, אליי הציפורת. אולם את, ההרגשת בציפורת ובי, ההרגשת כי גם נפשי נתונה בשבי, ומפרפרת ותלועה, ומצפה לישועה במחלפתך הכלואה. ובעינייך שוב אציץ ואבקש שם תשובה, וכבתחילה הן צנועות שתי יוני החן, מלא צניעות עינייך ומחלפתך משובה, היא אומרת לי, הן. מהרי, מהרי אחותי, נבוא היערה, תחת חופת אשרב לך כל נפשי אפיקה, ואת כל אהבתי התלויה בשערה, נמית שנינו בנשיקה.
Thank you. So beautiful. So beautiful. So who would like to read one of the translations? Great, Jonah. Thank you. And unmute yourself. Thank you. Which one are you going to read?
I'm pretty sure it's the Navo. It's the one that's like
Yeah,
side by side.
that's the bilingual. Yeah.
Okay, great. Butterfly. The world is drenched in song and sunshine, unimagined wealth of life. Between the forest and the furrow, silently we walk together as if our path were never ending, wading through a sea of cornstalks, butterflies about our heads, while golden spears from every tree pierce us through the leafy shadows. Is a small cloud or a cherub floating high above the world, taking my reflections with it, pure and as itself eternal, up and out to sea. Once again, the blue sky brightens. You walk ahead, I follow you through fields of ample, full-eared cornstalks, vistas radiant as your eyes. For a moment, I imagine, hidden in the darkening wood that breathes upon us dank and chilly, for us alone, a secret treasure beckons us to its mystery. Suddenly, the cornfield wavers as if a tremor blanched the sea. Who snowed upon this profusion? Swarms of pallid butterflies? One got caught, a fragile blossom, in your braided plait of hair. Gently bounced against your sash, it suggested, merest inkling, young man, kiss her, copy me. Did you sense this? Did you feel it? Know my soul's captivity? As caught, ensnared, in need of rescue, it flutters in your plaited braids. Let me in your eyes find answer. They hesitate like charming doves. But what price looks of chastity when wanton plaits are beckoning? Quick, my love, into the woods. Its fertile bough for canopy. It'll pour my whole soul. I'll pour my whole soul out to you, and we'll together kill with kisses my love that's hanging by a hair.
Yes. So thank you so much. Thank you so much. We're going to see the power of this and some strange mistranslations as well, where for some reason this mixture of love and death at the end is not fully perceived by the translator, but which I do want to kind of highlight. But let's just take. I want to kind of do this within for a little bit of time, so we have time for the other poem. But notice how the poem begins with being immersed in song and light. The Tovea ba'or vashir. We're going to come back to this issue. That's it's like immersion in a sacred pool. When a person immerses themselves in water for purification in a ritual sense, that's Tovea. It's not just, he's not just talking about drowning in light. Tovea is a person who is sinking into a ritual pool of purification. There is a kind of the atmosphere of the world is light and song. Sorry, it's visual and it's sound. It's those two qualities. And then we have this remarkable notion that that is the world. The world is filled with this. That the world is a kind of immersion pool, a mikveh. It's a place of tovea. It's a place in which one enters in everything as a place of visual and audio purification, right? That's how he is. That's how he begins. Kol ha'olam. It's filled with otzrot chayim lo she'artim misaviv mitrachashim. Otzrot chayim lo she'artim. They don't have measure. It's not just that they're unimagined. In rabbinic terms, a shi'ur is a measure. It's something that can contain the sacred. It contains the holy. It's a way of making measure out of the measureless. And he's saying that the fullness of Otzrot Chayim, he's also alluding, it's not only a transcendent notion, but the Otzrot Chayim allude to kind of an eternal dimension. He's playing on a whole series of rabbinic images that are now talking about what it means to walk through the earth as you're walking through a place of visual and audio purification. So that's that first sense of innocence, that first sense of purity. He has not yet talked about feeling the arousal of the erotic as an adolescent. And then, and they are walking, there's a kind of uvemishol hanimtach ben ya'ar v'nid shnenu holchim umachshim. There's a kind, they're walking in a place of the forest. This notion that will be very common in Bialik, that one goes from the outer world towards the center. And the center is a garden. It's a forest. It's a kind of Garden of Eden. It's a kind of centering point, right? And that centering point has a path, but the path is always leading towards the center. But the center is not a center external to the self, it's the center at the core of the self. And here it's shnenu, that the two of us are walking in silence, right? They're in this atmosphere of song. Ushnenu, the two of us are in silence, and we're going to see that sense of shnenu, the two of us, is a recurrent motif right up till the very, very end, next to the last word. Namit shnenu binishika. The two of us will die with a kiss, and I'll talk about that in a second. So there is the two-ness that it's together, that's in silence, that becomes aware of this. So as they're walking through these the corn stalks, then there is this, and the golden spears from every tree pierce us. Being in the shadow, and this kind of eros of the light, there's a kind of eros of the piercing, this kind of sexualization of the light penetrating, entering into the two of them as a kind of, in the tzele samarot, this kind of, the shadows of these overreaching boughs, this sense of the bower, of being in the bower, is now anticipating at the beginning of the poem the end, which will allude to the Song of Songs, when one says to the other, let us go under the cypress tree, let us meet in love. So the beginning and the end are mirroring from a certain kind of bucolic moment, right? The supernatural dimension emerges. Is this a demut of a keruv? It's a cherub. Is there something sacred that's flying across the world in the Rum Olam? That this is this enormous expanse of heaven. And Av Kala is also has high symbolism. And Av Kala is God descends to the earth in the book of Exodus to Sinai on an Av Kala, on this gentle cloud. There are some images that go back to the ancient Near East where the divine is manifest on the clouds of glory and thunder and lightning. And then there are various other ways in which that old theophany imagery of the divine appearing on thunder clouds appears on this delicate cloud. And that is what's happening. And then look at that third line in the Hebrew, Be'et hirhuriha tahor kamoha varam. Right, so he still has this pure thought. He's in this world of innocence. He is in this world and that the two of them go in this light, that the Zohar Harakia, that's the shining of the light, alluding here now to the book of Daniel, the Zohar Harakia Mazhirim, this shining effulgence of light. So as she goes and he's following. That's the two-ness of this adolescent pair. Va'ani karuch acharayich. So what's happening? There's a shift of that language towards innocence. He's recalling how he had this sense that he was bound to her, and that that there's in this world full of light. And then there's this issue of this mysterious unfolding of the butterflies that swoop down and that attach them. One of them attaches to her hair, right? There's a kind of the touch that he's afraid to engage in. There is the butterfly becomes a kind of displacement and animation of light that has descended from the heavenly spheres into this world of eros, of this traditional boy who sees this girl, perhaps this Russian girl with her braided hair, that illusion that seems to have been appears in some of his autobiographical writings. So I'm not just guessing. There is an illusion that he did have this kind of infatuation with this girl, and then at a later point in his life, he sees her married to another Russian peasant boy as he peeks from somehow behind the hedges. This sense of loss, of an unattainable love in all kinds of ways. And you see in the English, for the moment I imagine hidden in the darkening wood, the breath upon dank and chilly, for us alone in the secret treasure. That shift from the light to that darkness, because that darkness is what? It's evoking a kind of a deeper passion within him. It's evoking something he can't quite control. It's something that's coming, that's the dank, that's coming from the nether parts of himself. And that this butterfly catches onto her braids. And he sees this from behind, and he watches as she's walking how her plaited ponytail is bobbing, and this butterfly is caught at that point. He, in a certain sense, that's his soul, right? That's his soul of this boy who is beginning to experience the raw emotions of adolescence, but he's still within the consciousness of a traditional boy. And it's somehow the butterfly lingers on the braid, and the braid is sort of flopping behind her as he sees her, and it bounces against her sash. And it's sort of calling out to him at this kind of erotic call, right? Suggesting merely, young man, kiss me, right? He says, and then he, do you sense this? Do you feel it? Know my soul's captivity. He's speaking to her that he's both externalizing and internalizing that desire, and wanting her to know that he feels this passion, but his soul is a captive to the other side, that side of adolescent repression, that side of traditional hesitation, that inability to allow himself to fully feel what he's feeling. That issue of that his soul is caught in her braids, right? And her braids, of course, become symbolic from the biblical point of view of the braids of Delilah, right? That he's caught in that. The machlafot is that entwinement, right? It's the entwinement of sexuality that ensnares his soul, which is that butterfly. She is the butterfly, he is the butterfly. That is his longing that's connecting. And then there's this kind of interesting line here at the beginning of the final stanza. Uve'einayich shuv atzitz va'avakesh sham teshuva uchevatchila in tznuot shtei yonei hachem mali tzniut einayich umachlaftech mishuva hi omeret li hein. So this kind of, in her eyes, shuv, he sees again this answer and call to his desire. But there's a series of interesting puns. There's this shuv as renewal. There's the teshuva as this answer. And then it says in that third line, umachlavtech mishuva. Her braids is mishuva. In the prophets, mishuva is a negative, a person who sins, falls away from God, right? So he has captured in one this longing of return, this longing of renewal, and the mishuva is this kind of sense of sinning, this feeling of sin that's caught, which is the power of the term is the deepest ambivalence that it's capturing, right? Shuv, again, teshuva, an answer, a mishuva is that sin. He's capturing all in terms of that kind of erotic ambivalence that he is feeling. And she is sort of saying yes, and everything in his body is saying yes and no. And he's caught in that yes and no. And then he calls to her with this powerful echo of the Song of Songs. Mahari Mahari Achoti, calls her my sister, right? My sister, my bride, from the Song of Songs. Navoa Hayara, Navoa, again, these allusions of the Song of Songs. This attempt, there's something that's bursting out of him that still wants the two of them to be joined together. While once he sees the braid and he sees the butterfly and he sees what is uncapturable in his sensibility. And then he says, Tachat chupat asherav lach kol nafshi afika. He will pour out his entire being. It's a love that can be consummated together under the bowers of the trees in the forest. Again, this is alluding to the end of Song of Songs, chapter 1, but it's no longer an allegorical love between God and Israel. But it's the desire for some kind of an adolescent consummation. Et kol ahavati hatluya b'sa'ara, all my love, which is bound up in her love. In other words, that becomes the image of that love, which is displaced into the figure of hair, the figure of entwinement, the figure of desire that has captured his inner being. And then notice the ending. The ending is an astonishing ending. Namit shnenu binishika. So both translators absolutely miss this, and they miss this in a way that totally misses the power of the poem. So Nevo says, my love that's hanging by a hair will together kill with kisses. Kill with kisses, she says. My love that's hanging by a hair. And Atari has, to you all my love that's hung upon your hair will pull down with a kiss. It's mixing the verbs and the nouns in all kinds of strange ways. But what he's really saying is that his soul is bound with her soul that's now embodied in the entwinement of the strands of her braids. And that had been captured by that delicate kiss of the butterfly on her hair, this kind of eros that's not quite eros, that's longing and that has touch, but it doesn't. And then this notion, afik, I'll pour out my nefesh. He's really saying, I will die with you together. That's why it goes on to say, it says, kol nafshi afika, I will give my whole life to you. Right? I will pour out my whole life to you. Tachat chupat asherav, under these bowers. And these bowers become the objective correlative in their entwinement of the entwining of the hair and of the desired entwining of their souls, right? There's between the external tree, the hair, and the soul that's already bound up in the confusion of his consciousness, ve'et kol ahavati. Here again, kol now is coming back, echoing the beginning, right? Kol, the whole world, but now it's kol ahavati, the fullness of my love, which is tuluya b'sa'ara. So this is an astonishing image. It's not this hanging by a hair, right? At the one level, his whole eros is dependent and linked to the hair, right? That's what it means, tuluya b'sa'ara. It's linked to that. It's linked to the sa'ara is alluding in a kind of ironic way to that opening line where it says, lo she'artim. It has no measure. Sa'ara and she'artim, they're correlated. It's an unimaginable and unconsummatable love. But this tuluya b'sa'ara is alluding to the verse that appears in Job and the book in Proverbs, where it says that the whole world is hanging by a thread, right? Bechut hasara talui al blima. It's hanging by a thread, and in rabbinic literature, this whole notion that certain laws of the Sabbath are hanging by a se'ara, hanging by a thread. In the Mishnah, it says the laws of the Shabbat are tuluya b'sa'ara, they're hanging by a thread. They have, right? So it's sort of like this massive way of Shabbat in the Mishnah, in the rabbinic literature, is hanging by a thread because it's not really, his whole life is hanging by this thread of her hair. And so in a certain sense, it can't be supported, but it's dependent on it. Talui is dependence and hanging at the same time, right? And then it says, namit, when I pour out my soul, my whole body, in this eros of merger between youth and girl, namit shnenu, hear that shnenu, the two of us again, the separateness now will become one, binashika. So the mut b'neshika is a rabbinic image. Neshika, those who are interested, I wrote a book a couple of decades ago called The Kiss of God, in which the whole theme of dying at the kiss of God in mystical ecstasy is the theme. It appears in Christian literature as well. It appears, I'm not sure if it appears in Islam, but it's a theme that one dies with divine kiss. And of course, it takes over the imagery of Moses dying at the kiss of God. But to die by divine kiss is an ecstatic death. It's dying in ecstasy. In a certain sense, in the book, in the biblical literature, Moses resists and God takes his soul out of his breath through the kiss. But the imagery of the kiss appears in the Talmud, it appears in philosophical literature, it appears in mystical literature, and is actually ritualized in the daily rituals of Judaism in many ways. So if you're interested in that, it deserves a much larger comparison. I know that there's been some studies of this in Christian mysticism. I don't know in Islam, but this whole notion of the kiss of God as the way that the righteous die, the way that one dies in ecstasy, the purest of the death. And that's what he's saying. But what it does is, because the poem is also in secular terms, mot benishika, to die benishika, when you pour out your nefesh, your entire life, is here the deeper theme is not just boy, girl, love, consummation, but it captures the tension of eros and thanatos, doesn't it? Of love and death. It's a love that can only be consummated in death, or it's a love that wants to be consummated by dying into that love. But it's a love that would be the death of desire and the death of his life as an Orthodox boy at the end of the 19th century in Russia. So it's forbidden, but it's a desire for this this absoluteness, namit shnenu, that is, there's a poem in a certain sense ends with a prayer, doesn't it? Let the two of us die. Romeo and Juliet is the secularization of that theme of the boy and the girl who die mitat nishika, kissing, right? That Shakespeare has taken over that religious motif from Christianity, which arises first in Judaism. But that is a love that can't be sustained under certain social and emotional circumstances. But notice, just to return before I hear your thoughts, the issue of light, right? Light becomes light becomes the atmosphere and the fullness in which he is. And then there's this need to go into the shadow of the forest, where things become cooler and close. But what breaks forth into the forest are these shining, the shining light, which he talks about, the Zohar Rakia. He talks about the he talks about the Chanitot Shel Zahav, these spears. Already now we can see he already has an erotic image of the Chanitot Shel Zahav. This is kind of erotic feeling that's already not yet conscious to him of this erotic encounter that he's now the light that's shimmering down through the trees is already symbolic in an anticipatory sense of that breaking of light into his soul, of eros into his soul, and also the awakening of the desire and physical penetration that he's experiencing. And the poet is able to capture that through different registers of feeling and eros and fulfillment and desires. In the end, the poem ends with an unfulfillable desire of the Orthodox boy who could never have relation with this Russian peasant girl. But she is the source of his first feeling of what it means to have physical sensation, right? And that was captured through that incredible pun between teshuva and mishuva, right? She gives an answer to him, but the mishuva is, no, that's the sin. That's the pun that is at the tension point. And that the shnenu, which begin the two of them walking silently, then there's a kind of shift. She's in front of him, he's behind. And then the final shnenu of the two of us can only be consummated in death, right? So the sense of unfulfillability, of and it's all done. It's carried through the imagery of light in a series of figurative and emotional displacements. The poet is able to get that. He begins with this fullness of light, right? And then you get fragments coming in all kinds of different ways. They're coming in through the trees, which are really the kind of spears of eros, which awaken his soul. And then it appears really as this eruption of butterflies, a shelling, a kind of storm of beauty, of delicacy. It's not the harsh eros. It's this delicacy, and then it lands on the most sexual imagery. Hair is always a highly sexually charged image, right? And the hair now that's entwined becomes a displacement of longing. But the only merger that this religious boy can have now is imagining as if he was going to die in a spiritual ecstasy, right? He has to use that language in a certain sense. There's no way that he could ever acknowledge it. Even though it's a secular poem, he could never acknowledge it in secular terms. He has to kind of filter it through the tradition, which now brings this back as something that makes it sayable in a certain sense. Anybody have any thoughts about this? Things that I didn't mention or that you'd like to pick up? Yeah. Get in. You want to say
Yeah.
something? Okay, please.
Yeah,
Please.
I guess it's more of a question, and maybe the point is that this is sort of meant to be a tension, but I feel like there's, I think I'm having a little trouble sort of like understanding like the essence of the sort of the dual nature of the poem here, because I think that it's interesting to me because at moments it feels like the sort of sexual awakening is sort of being used as like not quite a stand-in, but like sort of a way of thinking about spiritual awakening in sort of like metaphorical terms. And at other moments, it's in the sexual awakening is sort of almost being used as an alternative to spiritual awakening, or like sort of something that is taking place because our narrator, our young adolescent, like hasn't had a spiritual awakening yet. And I think something that I'm curious about is, well, one, am I just totally misunderstanding? Or two, if there is something that's sort of meant to encompass, like if it is sort of meant to evoke both of those ideas, I guess I'm wondering, like, sort of I guess I'm wondering if it does encompass both of those, what are we to make of like this notion of two forces, especially related to like revelation or enlightenment, and nature sort of working in conjunction, but also having this occasionally oppositional relationship as well.
So I don't know. I mean, my first sense is that this is not related to his spiritual longing. It's really he notice at the end of stanza 2, "V'hakol bahir bo kamo be'enayich." He's in this dark forest, and it's this characteristic thing of religious literature that there's an illumined darkness, right? That's a kind of paradox in Jewish and Christian and Islamic mysticism. There's an illumination in the darkness, and that it's this darkness that somehow is revealing itself in the forest. Hakol bahir bo. Bahir is alluding to their mystical text called the Bahir of shining, like your eyes. So the eyes now become figures like the tziporet, like the butterfly. They contain these places like the jewels that he's talking about, right? And then he goes on to say, "Rega echad li nidmet," like that's the turning point. Then he's allowing it to come to consciousness. But it comes to consciousness as nidmet, as image, as allegory, as displacement. That in this place, ganuz matmon mistarim, there's some mistarim there's a mystical point here. There's a secret mystical place. Hamishumar me'az. He doesn't just use that word mishumar me'az me'olam l'shnenu. Ganuz mistarim. So he says ganuz matmon mistarim. So when he says ganuz matmon mistarim, the ganuz and the matmon is that there's a hidden mystical treasure. Hamishumar me'az. So this is also an illusion, because in early rabbinic midrash, God creates the world at the beginning, but the first creation of the world is such an illumined light that it overwhelms the world. So God takes that light and is ganuz. He hides it in heaven for the righteous in the world to come. And then he creates a natural light. The first light is a supernatural light, but it's too great for the world, and God hides this. It's mishumar, he hides, it's ganuz. So this or ganuz, this hidden light, is hidden in heaven for the righteous, according in the early midrashic rabbinic tradition and also mystical tradition, and that it's a light that's now disseminated for the righteous whenever they're ready for it and in the world to come. But he said it's hidden for us, the two of us, in this secret place, right? He's using this mystical language, but what is that thing? That it's the place of eros that can't be named, right? Light and eyes is that there's something he says nidmet. There's something it seemed to me, right? He can't say it exactly. It seems like the effulgence of a primordial light, the light of creation, right? That's what he's alluding to. That's what Bialik is alluding to. He knows the tradition that the first light, God creates the sun on the fourth day, but that's natural light. And all the ancients were struggling. What's the difference between the first light and the Wednesday light? And the difference is the first light was a supernal light, but it was too great to sustain anything. And God was afraid that it would be stained. So it was and then God had to create a natural light, the large light of the sun and the small light of the moon. And that becomes a kind of motif, but that hidden light is a mystical light. And he's now saying it's hidden there in the earth as a matamon. And he's alluding to many other midrashic traditions that I won't go into here about treasures hidden in the land. What I find so interesting among the light imagery is how he's trying to capture adolescent impossibility in a language that's so sophisticated. There's an enormous disjunction between this very sophisticated renewal of language and this kind of adolescent innocence, right? And we're going to see this even more. I don't think today we're going to get to the nights of the gnomes of the day. We'll pick up with that next time. But where he has the child's voice speak in an adult's language, which kind of, in other words, nostalgia can't speak in the language of childhood. Nostalgia speaks in the language of wherever you are through the nostos of the longing, right? So anybody have some thoughts about this? I want to just get some thoughts about this before we break. Yes, Maytel, please.
I have a question. It's more just about the name butterfly, and I was wondering how, I mean, does that connect to light, or do you have any thoughts on that? Because it's kind of I don't know, I read a big moment in the poem.
Well, it's nice that you say that. So I can't get into Bialik's head why he chose it. Obviously, his most famous first poem is El Hatzipor, which he talks about the bird that returns from Palestine, the land of Israel, to Russia, and announces that it's springtime. But if you were to add, if my first guess, look, I think Tzipor has this quality of the fluttering. He uses mifarperet. There's a fluttering and the blinking of light. If you were to ask me, how does it relate to light? This is a pure guess. In Aramaic, the word for morning is safra. Maybe, but who knows? It's say safra. But and don't forget, safra is like tzifr. It's a bird call. Tzipor. It's our word cipher and chirp. Chirp also is related through linguistic forms from cipher, tzirf, tzipor. It's a whole series of linguistic links between cipher and tzipor and chirp. It's just a different variation of all of these kinds of things. Dawn, light, bird. But what all that's really saying is that that's showing us the associations of the soul, right? What you're picking up and what Gideon was talking about, those associations are because they're all mixed together in him, right? How can you separate bird, butterfly, light, sexuality, fluttering, impermanence, and for me, that imagery of the girl that he walks behind, it's not for nothing that he has that, it's forbidden in rabbinic literature to walk behind a woman, right? That is a kind of forbidden because then you'd be focusing on the woman's body. He knows that. But by having the fact that he walks behind her, women don't walk ahead of men in traditional, in these kind of traditional circles. They walk behind. But it's because there's a whole ethos here, and he has reversed that a little bit, right? His arousal of eros of her bodies because he sees her from behind, but of course he's only focusing on her hair in the imagery. But yes, Jonah.
So I was wondering,
yeah, please.
Not so much like a full fleshed out idea, but like you mentioned, and clearly like he's working like that very classical, like the Shira Shirim, the Song of Songs, like love being like like the interplay between like sexuality and romance, and then religious belief or religious passion.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But like, and I'm thinking about it, and I feel like in the poem he kind of like, and maybe I'm kind of like going at an arbitrary distinction here, but he kind of, it seems to me like he's delicately kind of bouncing in between the language, and maybe I'm leaning too much on the English, but romance and like sex, if that makes sense as a distinction. Like on like some passages or some quotes seem to be not, and maybe a bit more like jade, like the language of like a more mature romance versus the more like adolescent, the more earnest or naive like sexuality of language.
Well, you're raising an interesting point. There would be genres, let's say medieval romance of the woman in the tower, of the chanson d'Arthur. I think where the woman is, she's in a tower, and she becomes a figure of feminine perfection, right? So she is unapproachable. Jewish mystical literature is filled with that. The Torah is like that woman, and the spiritual seeker walks around, and he's drawn to the tower, like Rapunzel, right, out there. But I think what you're helping us feel is that she's approachable and not approachable. She's an ideal feminine, but he has desire for her. She's not simply the pure feminine, right? You remember in Goethe's Faust, where he sees the eternal feminine, and he says, "Wait a while, you are so beautiful." He wants her to stop so he can focus on her perfected beauty. I don't think this is beauty as absolute perfection, but it's the arousal in that sense. So I think that he's used this religious imagery because it arouses in his reader precisely this complexity that you're speaking to. What kind of love is this? And what he himself is evoking this mixture of eros and longing and idealization, and she becomes the symbol of love that can't be consummated, but yet there's a pull. Come to me, kiss me. Can you know that? Do you know that you're calling me? Do you really know that? He's saying. He can only say that in his inner voice. He can't do it because of everything he is and has been brought up in a Puritan, pure setting. So it's not negotiable, but the thoughts are real, right? The thoughts are real and the feelings are real. And that's what he is. So he's speaking to he's also speaking to himself, but he's speaking to a world that's on the cusp of tradition and modernity that is also beginning to feel what it's like to have sexual feelings and not to displace them. So again, it's a different form of liminality than we saw in the first poem. But again, it's always on the border, and the language is this thing. Anyway, I think we should stop now. I have a doctor's appointment myself I have to get to. I think what we'll do is we'll pick up next time with Gemade Leil, that the imps or the gnomes of the night, because I did want to also very briefly let you see that Bialik, nighttime is also a place of a certain kind of illumination and a certain kind of light and fragmentation and the kind of animation, a different form of animation than Ayala Tashacha. It's a different kind of animation. So we'll pick up on that. When you're ready to send me one of your response papers, I'm sitting at the other end of cyberspace here in the East Coast, so I'm ready. Just be aware that time is going, but and if you have any thoughts, send me an email and we can do that. It can just be some initial thoughts of what's going through your mind now, based on some of the primary, secondary. It doesn't have to be an elaborate thing. Some of the thoughts that now have been awakened as we've been going through this about the mixture of imagery, relationship to some of the secondary sources, pick one stanza and go into it, whatever you like. In other words, this is for you to explore in any way that you like. Okay, so I'm going to, the material will be imported by Tzvi probably in an hour or so. And if anybody is aware, I think I know Anissa had to go to a meeting, but if anybody else is in touch with anybody else who was on at the beginning, just let them know that the material will be sent up soon. Okay, so thank you so much and look forward to see you guys next week. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.